right, so the class is going to be starting now. I already mentioned the rules. So we're going to be doing a class on mid-rounding. Mid-rounding is a pretty essential part of the game. I think it's one of the most thrilling parts of the game. There's a lot that is going on. There's a lot of elements that go on in the game that are pretty unpredictable. And mid-rounding is a really good way for you to kind of get an edge on the opponent just by understanding and having a lot of game sense. So this is going to help you a lot in getting started with that journey. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a lot of different things. We're going to kind of get a decision on what exactly constitutes a mid-round. We're going to also start talking about different things that you can look at resource-wise. And then from there, a lot of strategy related to that. And last but not least, we're going to be starting with this. We're going to be ending, with a little decision tree that you can use to sort of make a plan. All right, then you can use this for later down the line. You can use this, and it's going to be entirely related to mid, but we can sort of adapt it later and see if we can do something with it. Okay, for now, let's get started. So there's a lot of things that causes mid-round to start. However, they're all resource dependent. Okay, so as you can see, for example, let's say that you lose a player. Okay, a kill happens. Now you have a numbers disadvantage, you have less people on the field, and you have less vision, one less trade. This is one example of a resource that you have now lost because of a kill, right? Another thing that might happen is, for example, a push has failed. Okay, a push is something, for example, like a lot of utility has been used and someone's trying to take A site. Another example is a push happens and then a kill occurs, right? You're going to notice that these things do occur and they cause a lot of resources to be lost. Last but not least, we have the biggest resource in a round, and that is the timer, right? Time. When the timer hits a halfway point, I've said around the 45-second to pushing it by the minute and 10-second mark. Once that happens, you've now officially entered the mid-round, okay? Anything can happen right there. So if somebody's playing really slow, then that means they're giving up their early game to have a bigger advantage in the mid-round, right? So someone that defaults, a team that defaults, might be very passive, and they're doing it with the intention of causing no noise, causing no information to be given, no utility to be left out during the early game so they can have a bigger advantage later in the round. So this is an example of things. Sorry, these are some examples of things that might cause a mid-round to start. What happens if a site is rushed, however, and then the spike is planted? Well, we're no longer in the mid-round. This is end game. We have a little bit of time left. Whatever time we had left on the timer, whether it was a minute and 30 seconds or anything like that, that is completely gone. Okay. And what happens is you now have 45 seconds to defuse the spike. We have now entered the end game, the end of the round. Okay. The end of the round can be somewhere between, I'd say, less than 30 seconds, right, to the spike being planted. So if you decide to just rush in and then plant the spike, then you've now entered late round and you've basically forgot everything that happened in mid round. It is no longer there. Someone just asked, are you going to put the decision tree? Yeah, I'm going to make a better one for you guys in the future. This one's just a simple one. Okay. Next on that list, inventory and roll call. Okay. If you are not very familiar, with understanding your resources or understanding your inventory or understanding what has been used, it is important for you guys to look at who has died, who used what utility, what happened in a push, what happened so far. So for example, you can look at something like mid. You're starting early game. You can look at this example. Let's say that you are this player right here and you use up your dash, right? I always tell Jet players, if you use up dash and you don't have to use it at all, don't just throw it out there. If you're not looking for a rotation or something like that, you're just giving away information. Oh, they no longer have dash. They're going to be a lot easier to kill, right? This is an example of a resource that you can evaluate in your game. Let's say the same thing happens. Let's say you are playing on attack and you realize that the Jet dashed a little too early and they basically didn't get a kill. Now you know they have no dash. You know that that's not going to be an expectation in that game. This is an example of taking inventory. Taking inventory is really good when you're retaking a site. It's really good when mid-round happens because something is bound to occur. You can look at things like ultimates. You can look at things like the piece of utility that is causing you the most grief. It could quite literally just be an op, but you need to take an inventory of anything that's being used on the field that might cause a disadvantage. So if you want to look at just the currency, the amount of credits that the enemy team has as a form of taking inventory later in the round, you can do that, right? Another form of figuring out your inventory and roll call is identifying weak points. Okay. So roll call can be something like, we've lost all of our sentinels. They don't have a sentinel. We don't have a sentinel. So that means that our weak point on defense is our sites are easier to take if we don't have a well enough defense established, if we don't have a good defensive line on the choke. Whereas they no longer have any flank watch. They need to leave a player behind. So their push is going to be slightly weaker if they're not prepared. These are examples of weak points that you can identify mid-round. So even if no one has died, there's always something to be found in terms of weak points. Okay, it goes both ways. You need to identify, you need to find the resources that you need to allocate and reallocate. We have 3 players on A, but we lost one on B. Perfect. Move someone over to B. We need to have an even number of players. We need more players on site, right? These are things that you can do to always make sure that you have an advantage on defense. And then the last thing you need to do when assessing mid-round is information gathering. Too many times I find players mistaking getting information with taking a fight. There are things that you can do, such as scaling. It is a great tool for finding opponents in highly populated areas or hotspots, right? So for example, any main is a good example of a hotspot. There's always going to be players there, whether it's someone that's pushing up on defense, trying to get maybe a lurk, a flank, maybe just getting the orb, the ult orb, right? These are things that could happen. Or as opposed to someone leaving a lurk on attack and they're just trying to use it to get an advantage, or a late lurk, or a late flank, or a late push. These are all things that could be found out through the form of scaling. Scaling can be done quietly. You can poke, you can do it without any sort of utility, but it is important and essential for you guys to figure out what the enemy is doing when there is no noise being made. During mid-round, if you're not getting information, you are asking to just get slapped around, because I find that players that lose a lot tend to not get information as much as they should. Okay, one piece of advice that I have for you guys, try to look for rechargeable utility, try to look for offensive utility that you can try to use, like any offensive utility that you can use to sort of get space. So use this example right here. This guy can throw a dizzy, and then if nothing's happening there, he can pick it back up and know that there's no one over on C. He can also use this with a teammate and maybe take over this space, and now they have control of Mount. This is on Lotus, right? So, again, the inverse is if no one's there, you now have a way to get more space, okay? Pay attention to cooldowns. They're going to be doing the exact same thing. So if you were on the opposite side, and let's say you were KJ, and you were looking at that enemy, you can say, oh, they've used this piece of utility. They are now trying to do this, right? Would jet updraft be possible to use for information gathering? Yes, you can use updraft for information gathering. It is a little tougher to use, but there are some locations that are really easy to kind of apply. So for example, you can do it on Sunset. There's a lot of boxes that you can jump up on, so you can use it to kind of either maintain a power position, or you can use it to kind of identify where they are. You could also use this area right here. Maybe you can jump around the corner instead of just having a normal jump up. You can use them, right? But like I said, offensive utility is probably best. So unless you're using that updraft without knives, I wouldn't really recommend it as often, right? So try to pay attention to that part of the thing, right? Like, it has to be offensive. If you're just using it defensively or just for information, you got to make sure that someone's ready to follow up. You could be at risk. Okay. Right. Like I said, you cannot make any assessments, right, of the enemy if you don't know where they are. So you have to make sure that you're keeping that information at all times. Now let's look into adapting. First one is anticipation. And I'm going to give you guys basically this little area right here. It can be your checklist. If you really want to, you can take a screenshot of this, or you can look back on the video. These are things that you need to keep in mind. And these are things that, if we bring it back to the IGL class that I've done, these are things that I've told IGLs to keep in mind of. So for example, we need to look at previous rounds. Okay. Do they like to rotate, or do they like to re-hit, right? What are some things that the enemy has done in a previous round? What are things that you can identify about their strategy? This is why when I'm doing a VOD review, I tell players, look at what their comp is doing. Do they have a really aggressive brawler comp? Are they using it in a way to just get information? So are they using a lot of information characters, or do they have something like a Gecko Phoenix, and are they just trying to flash around corners, right? Identify their strategy based on what they've been doing, on what they like to do. Do they like to split sites? Their current game state is a pretty simple one. How are they positioning when mid-round started? Were they defaulting? Were they trying to get a push? where are they just trying to do something different this time around? Do they have an ult in mind, right? Identify their goal. This kind of goes back to like sort of like the ult, to the ult. You have to sort of make a call as to what they're trying to hit. I'd say that most of the time it's pretty easy to identify what they're trying to hit if you just kind of keep their ults in mind. But if they don't have any ults at all, then you just have to make a decision. Most of the time, if you're down a number, you're just trying to have to keep everything as even as possible on defense. And on attack, you can sort of make the same decision of, all right, we don't really know what site they're trying to stack, or we don't really know where, for example, this thing is. So when you identify their goal of what exactly it is they're trying to do with the defense, you can try to kind of poke at it. So this is a good example, right? Do they have an op, right? You can identify their goal of solo holding B by using an op. Or maybe you're kind of going up on tube and you're like, oh, there's a turret right over here. This is what they're trying to do. This is a goal that you can identify by using these tips. Last but not least, playstyle. When you're coaching teams, you always have to look at playstyles. This is not something that's, however, only stuck to coaches themselves. When you're playing your own game, you can really identify things that the enemy team likes to do. And it doesn't have to be just the team. It could be individual players as well. So for example, let's say that you have an enemy jet that really likes to swing. And I mean really likes to swing. You won't catch them here. They'll be pushing up on you. They'll be trying to get angles on you. This is an example of an aggressive playstyle. Or you can have the complete opposite where we have a KJ that likes to stay in the back lines and only act when a site has been taken. Really passive, but the one thing that they have up their sleeve is that they have lineups and they have really good setups to keep you stalled, right? So you have to look at those playstyles. Do they have both? Does the jet like to switch it up a little bit? Does the op result in a more defensive playstyle? These are things that we have to keep in mind when we're anticipating the enemy's next move. Does anyone have any questions about adaptation with some sort of anticipation? This one's pretty big. Any questions? None. Perfect. Someone just asked, what is the most common thing you see when you looked into at the higher ranks? So what do you mean by that? What's the context of that question? There's a lot of things I've seen in higher ranks. So which one? What are you talking about exactly?
When you're watching, like, say you're watching a pro game, right? Like DCT, for example. What's the most common thing that they try to pay attention to more than anything else?
Which one do they prioritize out of all of these?
Yeah.
So they tend to scrim a lot. So it's pretty easy to know that they've already sort of have a playbook in the back of their mind that the enemy might do. There's a lot of things when it comes to looking at previous rounds, but a lot of the times when they're poking around for information, they're looking at their strategy. Okay, which variation of this strategy are they doing this time? Which variation of this push are they going to do? That's something that they're always trying to do, and this is why you always see a lot of information being taken from all sides. If you have seen pro play, you might have noticed how slow it is. You might have noticed how slow the gameplay is most of the time, and that is the reason why. They're basically looking at trying to get information out of them, trying to figure out where their positions are, trying to get utility out of them. So they're mainly trying to identify their strategy, if we had to look at it that way. It doesn't have to always be like that in your games, though. I've noticed that there's some players, because again, if you're looking at ranked, it's pretty game dependent. You can do things like, what exactly can I look at in their current game state that makes it easier for me to win those fights? Okay, so that's something you can do. What if they keep changing their playstyle every round, like how they entry? When you're looking at that, I think I'm just reading currently somebody's response to that. You can play to deny the entry player teammates from getting in. Yeah, so let's say you are a sentinel and you're trying to deny that entry, right? If you're trying to deny that entry and you're trying to push in, and let's say, for example, you put a trip in response to what someone is doing. What I like to tell players is that you just have to make a call. This is a thing that I find that gets players stuck. They are really afraid of making a decision. You also have to make sure that when you make a decision, you're kind of covering your bases. So let's say that you are playing over here in generator and you know that the jet is going to dash in, so you put the trip for it, but now jet dashed in on the left side. Well, your trip now has nothing to do with that side. You are now in a position where you have to fight. However, if you basically planned accordingly, you are able to use something like, for example, you can call for the Sova to be right up there, and you can tell them, can you watch my right side, or something like that, right? You can do things like that. How do I practice? Always remembering to identify patterns. That's something that just comes to you naturally, but you have to be asking questions at all times. Okay. VOD reviewing is really good for it. I do think that scrims are also a really good way of doing it, but the one that you can always use is asking questions in the simplest degree. Why did we lose that round, or why did we win that round? It could be something as simple as everybody just swung and it was just a cluster of everybody taking a fight, or it could have been simply we had post plant potential. We had a lot of mollies and stuff like that. And that's something you can use, right? Oh, we have a Viper, we have a Sova, we have a KJ. That's really, really, really good post plant potential. So that means that when I see that on the enemy team, it's very likely that they're going to be using these three characters to play post plant, right? So just use patterns. It doesn't have to be from the same game. The same thing happens in your elo at all times. If you notice there's a jet that picked up an op, you're probably going to see them in the same place at all times, right? Just pick up those patterns from every single game and just pick up basically a playbook of all the things you've seen. And it's going to be in the back of your mind at all times. You don't have to write them down or anything like that. I know there's some players that struggle with keeping it in the back of their mind, so they actually write them down. So you can do that as well. All right, moving on to the next one. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So, like, would the Sentinels versus Genji, where Sentinels were constantly sitting there adapting, playing retake with, I believe it was Genji on Icebox.
Right.
Would that be like an example of how they were adapting to how Genji was playing? If that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a pretty standard example. Yeah, I would say so. Someone just said, "Were you joking with that one, Valid?" Yeah, I don't think that does anything. I think that's a joke, by the way. I don't think doing human benchmark for pattern recognition does anything. It's a funny joke though. But again, if you really want to practice on that and you really, really want a surefire method, if you watch pro play, take note of a certain player. Take a note of your favorite player. So watch, for example, I hacking love Tense. So watch Tense and be like, what is he doing? Oh, he is currently in the back of sight and he really likes to put the smoke there. And you can ask questions. What did that smoke do? Right? It's a lot of questioning, and this is where one-on-one coaching comes in a lot of the times. If you can't really find that thing, this is where coming here and asking question comes in. So just make sure you're using that at all times. But yeah, let's see what we can do with the next one. Okay. Like I mentioned, mid-round is pretty thrilling. There is a lot going on. There's a lot of risk assessment that you have to pay attention to, and there's a lot of mind games. Okay. Counterplay is perhaps the more advanced way of playing mid-round, right? We've talked about conditioning. We've talked about different ways that you can sort of set a pattern or a standard of how things are going to happen. It could be something as simple as every single time that we have breach ult, we're going to hit A, right? You can use these things to create a pattern. However, some of these things might cause a bigger risk than others. Okay. When you're looking at patterns, you got to always make sure that when you're taking a risk or anything of that matter, you're always paying attention to the downsides. Some downsides are bigger than others. So, for example, right here that I shown right there, let's say that you are down a player. One risk that you might be able to take is if you know that they're coming out over here, you can throw a flash and potentially get a fight and maybe get a player, which could cause you to get a man advantage or a man, a neutralizing one, right? So you can basically do that, or you can play it safe and play with your team and try to get as many trades as you can, right? These are things that you can do at all times. So pay attention to different strategies that you can make to sort of identify the better play. I never tell players to always pick the safe play. I think that players that always play safe will always have a harder time adapting in later rounds or adapting in later elos when they do manage to climb. So I tell them that if you're having a really hard time making the risky play, try to do it occasionally. Sprinkle it in your rounds. So out of 12 rounds in one half, take 3 risky plays. It might end well, it might not. It quite honestly could cost you the game, but I need you to try those things in order for you to develop. it will engage you in your brain. You'll know exactly what worked and what didn't, and it'll also force you to get better mechanically. Okay. But that's not all, right? You can also do these risky plays to disrupt something in the enemy team. Perhaps a strategy, perhaps you're denying a resource like an orb over here. You have to do it so they don't get this particular ult, right? You don't want Breach to get that ult. You can do it to also exploit a weakness. Maybe they're not taking long. Well, now you know you can take this and you can have control of TP, right? There's a lot of risks that do come in. You just have to make sure that you're assessing them. And I use the example of me and a player down because that is the most common example of what the risk is going to be. You're going to be losing a player, right? So make sure that you're doing it with that intent in mind and you're aware of what's going to happen. So like I said, sprinkle it in. And once you start getting a little bit more confident taking that fight, you can start doing it a lot more often. So 3 rounds max. And once you start getting better, you can start adding it in more. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the simple decision tree that we need to understand. Okay, this is an example of a mid-round decision tree that you can use, and we're going to be using it in the example of the enemy taking mid. Okay, in higher elos, this becomes far more nuanced. It becomes far more detailed. It becomes way more complex. But for now, let's look at this one. So let's say that you are playing and you think they're going to be taking mid. They're going to be taking mid. Maybe you don't know. So you start asking questions. This is how you can start assessing your next move. So let's start. You're playing over here, and it's like, okay, is the enemy taking mid? If the answer is yes, you can ask yourself and your team, can we fight for it? If the answer is no, you have to give it, right? There's nothing you can do. But when you give up mid, it can become a lot more complex. Like, do they have any control of the mains? You can say they don't have control of A main. Okay, take A main. Take it slowly. Or you can take it fast. Who knows? Okay, they don't have any control of any of the mains. Take both of them, for example, right? You can use that for information gathering. You can use that to scale. You can use that to counter them. Okay, and when you're coming to fight, you can say, can we fight it? Do we have the right utility to fight it? Do we have smokes? Do we have flashes? And you can use this to get a better contest. Let's say the enemy is not taking mid. Is the site being taken? You can say, yeah, A site is being taken. You can rotate to A site. No site is being taken. Can we push mid back? And you can do things like, no, we can't push mid. Then we just have to hold our position. There's nothing we can do to take this site. Or you can do something like, site is being taken and we can push mid, but we don't know how many there are. Okay, then we can scale. We can do it with some information. Maybe holding positions is just getting information through maybe a dart. Think of Ascent. Maybe your Sova can send you a dart. Maybe your KO can send a knife, right? These are examples of things that you can do to create a better decision in the mid round. I'm gonna see if I can develop this in the future for players that want a little bit of a guide. Essentially, just a cheat sheet for those that are really confused as to how to make a good decision. This is something I'm going to develop later in the future. So if you have any particular scenario that you really want, I might help you with it. I'm going to be doing a Jet Masterclass on how to play Jet. And a lot of these decisions are going to be related to your dash and your utility, right? Do I have dash? No. Playback. I have dash. Okay, you can swing them at this position, like we talked about in that previous entry class that we did yesterday. Not yesterday, 2 days ago. Okay, so with that out of the way, we are pretty much done here. That's pretty much it. We're pretty much going to be calling it there. We actually ended on time. Pretty cool. Does anyone have any questions you guys would like me to answer? We've been answering a lot of questions in regards to identifying strategy and patterns. Again, it'll take a little bit of time. Don't worry. Now's a good time to ask a couple of last questions. And if you can't, I recommend that you go into the YouTube channel or just ping me here. Both of those will be a good way for you to get that. Can we get a Yoru Masterclass in the future? Oh my God, a Yoru Masterclass? Like a decision tree Masterclass? I think that if I just do a duelist, decision-making Masterclass, it'll cover Yoru. But if I do a Yoru only, I'm sure there's a guide from a way better player than me. So I'll let you decide on that one.
Can we get an economy masterclass in the future?
Oh, what's that?
An economy masterclass.
Economy. I've done a couple of those, but I think they're not uploaded, so I might look into that. I think I used to make one where we did a decision tree on the economy and how you can buy. So yeah, we can look into that. Okay. Keep these keep these suggestions and either send them to me or just put them in the chat in general, and I'll compile them and I'll make those classes for you. How to solve brain deadness? Just focus, man. Just lock in. Come on. Okay, let's call it here. I'm gonna close the class. And for everybody that's ready to start,